It was supposed to be a shortcut. Dana and her younger brother, Ryan, were driving through the vast, empty expanse of rural Wyoming, heading to a family reunion. The highway was endless, flanked by barren fields and distant mountains. And the GPS had insisted there was a quicker route, a backroad that cut through a dense patch of forest. Dana hesitated, but relented when Ryan groaned. "We'll never get there, at this rate." The turnoff came suddenly, marked by a weathered sign that read Cedar Hollow Road. The asphalt faded to gravel, and the towering pines swallowed their car whole. "Creepy much?" Ryan joked, scrolling through his phone. But Dana noticed he wasn't getting a signal. The deeper they drove, the stranger the road felt. The air was unnaturally still, the forest unnervingly silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the crunch of gravel under their tires. As they rounded a bend, Dana slammed on the brakes. "What the—" Ryan leaned forward. Ahead, the road vanished into the forest as if it had been swallowed whole. The gravel ended abruptly, leaving only a tangle of trees and overgrowth where the road should have continued. Dana frowned, gripping the wheel. The map showed it connecting to Route 46. "This doesn't make sense." Ryan pointed at the GPS screen, now frozen. The words "recalculating route" blinked repeatedly. Frustrated, Dana shifted into reverse to turn back, but as the car began to move, the engine sputtered and died. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, turning the key. Nothing. The forest around them seemed to press closer, the shadows deepening. Dana's heart raced as she opened the door, stepping out to check the engine. "Stay in the car, Ryan," she said, but Ryan had already gotten out. His curiosity piqued by a faint sound, a low, rhythmic thumping coming from the woods. He squinted into the shadows, the sound growing louder, more distinct. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, like footsteps. "Ryan," Dana called, slamming the hood shut. "Get back in the car." Ryan didn't move. His eyes were fixed on a figure emerging from the trees. It was a man, or at least, it seemed like one. He was tall, his face obscured by the brim of a hat. He carried something long and heavy, dragging it behind him. The sound of metal scraping against the gravel sent a shiver down Dana's spine. "Hey!" she shouted, waving her arms. "Can you help us? Our car broke down." The man didn't respond. He stopped a few feet from them, tilting his head as if listening to something only he could hear. Then slowly, he raised his hand and pointed back down the road they had come. Dana's blood ran cold as she realized the road was no longer there. The way they had driven in had vanished, replaced by an unbroken wall of trees. What's happening?" Ryan stammered, backing toward the car. The man took a step forward, his heavy boots crunching against the gravel. Dana grabbed Ryan's arm and pulled him toward the car, slamming the door shut. The figure stopped, standing motionless in the middle of the road. Then, with a deliberate slowness, he removed his hat, revealing empty hollow sockets where his eyes should have been. Ryan screamed, and Dana jammed the key into the ignition, desperate for the car to start. The engine roared to life, and she floored it, swerving around the figure. But as they sped down the road, Dana realized with mounting horror that the forest around them was changing. The trees bent unnaturally, their gnarled branches clawing toward the car. And then the road split into two. One path curved left, the other veered right. Both seemed identical, yet something deep in Dana's gut told her the wrong choice would be fatal. "Which way, Ryan?" she yelled. Ryan looked out the window, his face pale. He's still following us. Dana glanced in the rearview mirror. The figure was running now, impossibly fast, dragging that heavy object behind him. And for the first time, she saw what it was. A rusted, blood-stained axe. Dana's hands gripped the wheel so tightly, her knuckles turned white. The trees seemed to close in around them as she sped down the road, the figure gaining on them with each passing second. The headlights flickered and the engine sputtered again. The sense of being pursued, of being trapped, grew overwhelming, and her mind raced, desperately searching for any explanation for what was happening. "Why is he chasing us?" Ryan shouted, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "I don't know. Hold on," Dana shouted back, pushing the pedal harder. The tires kicked up gravel, sending it skittering into the woods on either side. But the figure didn't slow. He was still coming, moving with unnatural speed, dragging the axe behind him like it was nothing. Then, just as Dana thought she couldn't take the pressure anymore, the road ahead split again. The path to the left was dark, thick with shadows and overgrown weeds, while the one to the right seemed slightly more open, but equally menacing. There was no time to think. "Left!" Ryan screamed, his eyes wide with terror. Without hesitating, Dana veered left, her tires screeching against the gravel. The sound of the man's footsteps echoed through the night, relentless and unyielding, as though the forest itself had conspired to trap them. But as they sped into the narrowing path, something shifted. The air grew colder, and an oppressive silence descended upon the car. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of their breathing. Dana's heart raced in her chest as she stole a glance at Ryan. He was staring out the window, his face pale, his expression unreadable. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Ryan?" Ryan didn't respond. He was fixated on something outside. Something moving in the shadows of the trees. Slowly, his head turned to face her, and for a moment, his eyes seemed empty, as if something had taken hold of him. "Ryan, what are you—" Before she could finish, the car lurched forward, throwing both of them against their seatbelts as it careened down the road. The headlights illuminated a figure standing in the middle of the path. It wasn't the man with the axe, but something far worse. A pale, twisted version of a human being. Its limbs contorted at unnatural angles, its face a grotesque mask of twisted features. Dana slammed the brakes, but the car didn't stop. Instead, it seemed to lurch forward, as if pushed by an unseen force. She struggled to regain control, but the steering wheel spun violently out of her hands. The figure in the road grinned, its mouth stretching wider than humanly possible, its eyes filled with malice. The last thing Dana saw before the world went dark was the figure raising its hand. A signal, and then everything went black. When Dana opened her eyes, she was no longer in the car. The world around her was a blur, and for a moment she didn't know where she was. A thick mist hung in the air, swirling around her like something alive. She sat up, the cold earth pressing against her skin, and blinked against the fog. "Ryan?" she called out hoarsely. There was no answer. She struggled to her feet, her head spinning. Her surroundings were strange. An eerie forest of twisted trees, their branches curling and reaching like hands. The air was heavy with an unnatural stillness, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The fog seemed to obscure everything, and she couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Panic set in as she realized she was alone. "Ryan?" she cried again, her voice trembling. Still no answer. She turned in a circle, desperate to find something familiar. But the forest was the same in every direction, dense, suffocating, and endless. Dana's chest tightened as she stumbled forward, not sure if she was heading in the right direction or deeper into the unknown. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps reached her ears, slow and deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat as she spun around, her heart pounding. A figure stood in the distance, shrouded in the mist. At first, she thought it was Ryan, but as it drew closer, she realized it was something far worse. The figure moved with an unnatural grace, gliding through the fog like a phantom. It wore a tattered coat, and its face was hidden in shadow, just like the man who had chased them. But this time, there was no axe. This time, there was nothing but the darkness of its size. Dana took a step back, but the figure was already upon her. It reached out a long skeletal hand and gripped her arm, its fingers cold as ice. She gasped, trying to pull away, but the grip tightened, and a voice, low and rasping, whispered in her ear, "Welcome to the Hollow." The words sent a chill down her spine. Dana's mind raced. The Hollow. Was this a dream? A nightmare? The figure's grip slackened, just enough for her to wrench her arm free. She backed away, breathing heavily. But the figure didn't move, watching her with those dark, empty eyes. I don't belong here," she said, more to herself than to the creature before her. "I need to find Ryan. We're not supposed to be here. It's too late," the figure interrupted, its voice a rasping hiss. "You've already crossed the threshold." Dana froze. "Threshold?" she whispered. The figure stepped forward, its movement almost fluid. "The Hollow takes all who enter. Time doesn't work the same here. And once you've come, you can't leave, not without paying the price." Dana's blood ran cold. She glanced around, but the mist was thicker now, and she couldn't see anything beyond the shrouded trees. "Where's Ryan? What have you done with him?" The figure tilted its head. "He's here, somewhere, but not in the way you think." The words made Dana's stomach churn. She took a step back, trying to steady her breath. "I need to find him. I need to get out of here." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it reached into the fog and pulled something from the air. A glowing orb, faintly pulsing with a strange light. It held it in front of Dana's face, and she felt a pull, an invisible force drawing her toward it. "No," she whispered, stepping back. But the orb's light grew brighter, more intense. And then the world around her began to shift. The trees twisted, bending at impossible angles. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, revealing a yawning abyss below. "No!" Dana screamed, her heart pounding. "I don't want this!" The figure's voice echoed through the shifting forest, its words a cruel promise. "This is the Hollow's gift, and now you will join us." Dana's body tensed, her heart hammering in her chest as the ground trembled beneath her. The abyss opened wider, pulling at the very air around her, a vortex of darkness that seemed to hunger for her very soul. She could hear a faint whisper, growing louder, rising from the depths below. "You're ours now," the figure said, its voice now echoing with countless others, like a chorus of lost souls. The orb in its hand pulsed with an eerie glow, and Dana felt it tugging at her very core, as if it were drawing out her essence, her very will to fight. "No. No." Dana gasped, taking another step back, her body trembling with fear. "I can't. I won't." You have no choice, the figure crooned, its dark eyes gleaming like voids, absorbing every ounce of her fear. You've entered the hollow, and now you must pay the price. Terror gripped her throat as she turned to run, but the forest around her seemed to warp, the trees bending and shifting, creating an endless maze. The road she had followed was now lost to her, nothing but the twisted woods and the oppressive darkness. Ryan? She screamed into the thick fog, her voice frantic. Where are you? But there was only silence, the kind that pressed against her eardrums, suffocating and cold. Then the whispering began again, this time from all directions. It was impossible to pinpoint its source, but it seemed to come from the very air itself. You cannot leave without paying the price. The figure stepped closer, its long, bony fingers reaching toward her once more. Dana stumbled backward, her breath ragged, until her back hit something solid. A tree, but it wasn't a tree anymore. It was a shape, a shadow, a being, a ghostly silhouette of a man. Dana gasped, her heart leaping in her throat. Ryan? She whispered, her voice breaking. The figure before her flickered, and in an instant it was gone, replaced by Ryan's familiar face. But it wasn't Ryan. Not really. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glassy, his body unnaturally still. He looked as if he was standing on the edge of the abyss himself, a mere puppet of whatever force controlled this place. Ryan! Dana choked out, reaching for him. But as her hand neared, he stepped backward, vanishing into the fog once more. No! Dana cried, stumbling forward. Come back! The figure, no, it was him, or at least the thing that once was him, reappeared at the edge of her vision, whispering coldly, You wanted to leave, didn't you? Now you can never leave. A sudden, overwhelming pressure filled the air, and Dana's vision blurred. Her thoughts were scattered, as if they were being ripped apart by invisible hands. Her body felt like it was being crushed under the weight of the hollow, and for a moment she thought she might lose consciousness. But then a voice, not from the figure, but from within her own mind, whispered fiercely, Fight, you must fight. Dana didn't know where the voice had come from, but she clung to it like a lifeline. She straightened, her mind clearing for a moment as she turned back toward the figure. The realization hit her like a wave. This place thrived on fear, on the hopelessness of those who wandered too far in. She wasn't going to give in. Dana turned and ran, pushing through the thick fog, every step bringing her closer to something, the possibility of escape, or the final embrace of the hollow. She didn't know, but she had no other choice. Behind her, she could hear the figure's voice growing faint as she ran deeper into the forest. Then, in a flash of clarity, she saw it. A light flickering through the trees, a doorway, a way out. The very air around it hummed with energy, and Dana ran toward it, her legs burning with exhaustion, her heart racing. With one final desperate push, she reached the light and stepped through. The world twisted, a moment of pure vertigo. And then, silence. She was standing on the edge of the forest, the road she had taken to the hollow, stretching before her. The figure was gone. Ryan was gone. The mist had lifted. She turned, looking back at the dark woods, unsure if what she had just experienced had been real. But there was no sign of the hollow, no trace of the forest that had consumed them. Dana breathed a shaky sigh of relief, but the eerie feeling lingered in her chest. The price hadn't been paid yet. The hollow's reach would never fully release its hold. And as she stepped into the car, Alone and shaken, she realized with a creeping certainty that something or someone was still watching her from the shadows.